out in the streets, indifferent and unmovable, till somebody says to the right, until somebody says amen. We always stand apart.
Welcome to Gaslit Nation. I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones, about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine.
The song you heard at the top of the show was Stand Apart by Vague Pains, fusing elements of shoegaze, classic indie, and new wave into an irresistible kaleidoscopic sound. Vague Pains is the project of singer-songwriter Zachary Lemon. Working out of his basement studio in Michigan, Zachary and his remote collaborators pay tribute to the past while pushing the genre into fresh new territory. Zachary provided this statement about the song. Stand Apart is about trying to trust another in the midst of all the chaos we're living through. It's about realizing the world is an unjust place and trying to overcome your often justified mistrust of others to make a real connection with another person. It's a love song for Orwellian times. I just want to tell you, Zachary Lemon and everyone involved in the song Stand Apart, what I just read, which you provided, it is the theme of my Dorothy Thompson screenplay, which is the focus of this week's episode. But you just nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. This feeling that we're living with today and that they lived with in the 1930s and 40s. And then Zachary adds a PS. It is truly an honor to have my music on the podcast. I have a tremendous amount of respect for your work. Thank you so much, as I do of yours as well. Hearing your encouragement for people to keep making art helped motivate me to see this album, Fragile Rush, through. Well, everyone check out Vague Pains. Everyone check out their album, Fragile Rush. We'll post a link to their song that you just heard, Stand Apart, on our social media feeds and in the show notes for this episode on our Patreon page. You can find more music from Vague Pains on Apple Music, Spotify, and SoundCloud, and on Bandcamp at vaguepains.bandcamp.com. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us, Zachary.
Mr. Jones. It's based on a true story of an incredible era we're going to be exploring today, the rise of Hitler and Stalin, who of course led us into World War II. And the anti-fascist journalist who covered it all was Dorothy Thompson, one of my personal heroes and historical mentors for helping us make sense of the times we're in. You may know Dorothy Thompson from her 1941 essay, Who Goes Nazi?, which went viral when Trump came to power in 2016. Thompson was one of the most influential and extraordinary journalists and sought-after speakers in the 1930s and 1940s, as famous as Eleanor Roosevelt. Her work inspired her husband, the Nobel laureate Sinclair Lewis, to write It Can't Happen Here, a now classic novel about an American Hitler coming to power. So gather in close because this is going to be a cozy slumber party fireside chat, because this interview is one for the record books here at Gaslit Nation. We are a unique podcast in the sense that we are the first to ring the alarm about fascism in America, but we've done it from the perspective of the importance of making art, to fight back with art. I am very pleased to say that today's guest, the acclaimed author Peter Kurth, author of several must-read books, including on Isadora Duncan, and the one we're going to be discussing today, American Cassandra, The Life of Dorothy Thompson. Peter's book and I are both attached to a historical drama inspired by the incredible life of Dorothy Thompson. This means that my next follow-up project to Mr. Jones is a Dorothy Thompson movie, and the underlying source material of that is Peter's fabulous book. So I'm obviously very nervous because I'm putting the finishing touches on my Dorothy Thompson screenplay and sending it to Peter over the holidays for Peter to read, shaking his head, shaking his fist at all my poetic license. So the first thing I want to start off by saying, which is so fascinating. So in my life, I have so many extraordinary friends who are anti-fascist journalists, anti-fascist analysts, whose job is, their work focuses on collecting war crimes. They stare at death, mass murder all day long. And in our very deep conversations about the times we're in, it always goes back to mental health and how we manage our mental health. And I always say to them, well, get a therapist. But they say, no, I don't want to grow soft. I don't want to become mushy. I've got to stay strong. We're in a war. But the reality is that Dorothy Thompson and all of the journalists of her generation that were covering Hitler and Stalin, they were seeing analysts, because Freud and all of his disciples out of Vienna, where a lot of these journalists like Thompson were based, that was the big thing. That was the hottest thing, was going to go see an analyst. I wanted to start off with that because I think today in my field, we don't really normalize therapy. It's all about suck it up, walk it off. But back then, they were all seeing analysts. So I guess let's just start there.
Well, I'll tell you, they were also all having sex with each other, if you don't know that.
I picked up on that.
That was, you did. I think it was, in part, fashionable.
The analysts or the sex?
Well, probably both, actually, knowing these people, because they were all up here. And I know Dorothy wrote a great deal, not mostly for publication, about in these terms, in the terms of analysis. She had seen Dr. Theodore Reich, and she knew Freud, and she knew him well enough to be able to call him in the middle of the night. So this was part of her circle, her very intellectual, inquiring circles, inquiring in every way. You mentioned art. Well, they were creating a new art, actually, with their independent reporting. I'm going to put it that way. That was the demand they all made on each other, was freedom. They demanded it for themselves, and they demanded it from each other if they were mixed up together. I mean, it was a fashion. It wasn't just in Vienna and Berlin and Europe. It was also in New York. It was building in New York. It became decidedly upper class, or at least moneyed class. It wasn't like it is now, where I don't know what it's like where you are, but in Vermont, where I am, anyone who wants to be a therapist can hang a shingle out. There's no requirements at all. And this is a very different thing from what she was encountering there.
It's just so odd to me. Like, her impact cannot be overstated. Could you just run it down for people? Because today she's largely forgotten, but at the time...
Well, it's interesting about that. She is and isn't forgotten. Since I wrote that book, which was a long time ago, 1990 it was published, it was my hope that she would spread, that her example and her words would spread further. And to some degree, I would say now, looking back, they have. But I think in certain ways that I didn't expect to, I hadn't imagined it, rather. She is a name now that signals one thing, which is anti-Nazi. And that is, I would say, obviously her most important legacy, was her recognition and action that she took against the Nazis rising and especially in power. And the example she made of rousing this country into fighting Hitler. She was the first, if you want all the firsts, she was the first woman to head a foreign correspondence bureau in Europe. She was made bureau, Curtis Martin newspapers, which were the Philadelphia Public Ledger and the New York Post at that time. And she was the first woman appointed to head the bureau. And this is only because she had distinguished herself as a stringer. She had gone to Europe with a girlfriend in 1920, and they were looking for, I expect she had many high ideas. One of them, I expect she wanted to write a brilliant novel about herself. I think that was definitely something she wanted to do. But she just started writing. She started writing and submitting copy, and she persisted until some of her stories were bought. And then she became known, and then she became dependable and reliable. So she was hired by the Curtis Martin on the condition that she could write whatever she wanted and that they could reject anything that they didn't like. She was not bound to them in any editorial sense. And that worked so well. She was in Vienna that she moved to Berlin, and they made her the bureau chief for all of Central Europe, which became her specialty. She was really, really knowledgeable about the very confusing politics of that huge region of Europe, which included the Balkans. It included Greece. It included Turkey, even, at least in her coverage. Her early stories are still on microfilm at Syracuse University, where she left the bulk of her papers. And they're really, really a blast to read. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of her early stringer stories wandering around Europe by herself. She had a gift for knowing everyone. She had a gift for welcoming people. She had a gift for discerning their strong point. And it wasn't long in the European culture that she was deeply embedded and was accepted basically as one of them. She spoke fluent German quickly. She learned it, and she always spoke it. Germany was where her heart lay in many ways. It was Germany and Austria. The German world was hers. And so when she saw Hitler on the rise, she at first was like everyone else. It was just another guy on the rise in a very bewildering political scene. If anyone remembers her at all, I just saw this yesterday in some publication online, I can't remember, some radical sort of thing. It was complaining that Dorothy Thompson had not turned against Hitler until after he kicked her out of Germany in 1934, which is simply mistaken. That is why he kicked her out of Germany in 1934, is that she was so militantly against him already. She wrote amazing profiles of the German world in the early 30s for the Saturday Evening Post, believe it or not. I can't say for sure. I don't know when it changed into a kind of homey, cozy magazine the way it was when I was growing up. But in the 20s and 30s, it was a serious magazine, and she wrote really, really incisive, long articles about what was going on in Germany in the early 30s. Her heart was broken by a handsome Hungarian. She married him even though she knew he would be unfaithful, and he was. And it wrenched her terribly. It was if you've seen those letters, they are also at Syracuse. Her letters to him and to a few other people during that time were heart-wrenching. She was obviously traumatized and devastated by this experience because she had not, it was her only, at that point, only relationship with a man that is on record that we could say she is actually involved with. She had lesbian experiences early. She had been in the women's suffrage campaign in New York State all the way through it, championing, obviously, for the vote. And she had made intense, passionate friendships with women in those circumstances, in those days, as was not uncommon, I think, in those circles in those days. And her sexual orientation, as we might say, becomes a little complicated because she did go on to have at least one other serious lesbian affair while she was married to Sinclair Lewis. But she didn't think of herself that way, and she didn't pursue it in any direction that we know of after that. She did not become a friend of Bilitis, let's say. She did not become that. In that sense, she followed her, I guess we can say her heart, or at least her whim. She had a lot of affairs with men and was married 3 times. But before she married Sinclair Lewis, she had had her heart broken. He swept her off her feet in a manner of speaking, but I believe she was actually looking for someone to replace this. They were exactly different. They could not have been more different. Sinclair Lewis and her Hungarian Bruno. He was really something, I'll tell you. And Sinclair Lewis was not. Sinclair Lewis was instantly not just unappealing, but kind of a little bit horrifying in person because he had this condition on his face that made it bright scarlet red. It's talked about a lot. He called them his hickeys. They were his tragic appearance all of his life. And also, he was skinny and spindly, and someone described him as a man getting up in sections when he rose from his chair. that he was exactly bent in certain ways. And when he stood up, he was tall and thin. And she said his face like a flamethrower. And who knows why she went for him, but she accepted his marriage proposal almost instantly and dedicated herself to his genius as she saw it. And she wasn't wrong to see it in him, a kind of genius. But she, for briefly, turned herself over to that, to marriage and motherhood. They had one child, Michael Lewis, but it didn't help. It didn't hold her, I should say, because she was already back on the trail in 1930 when Lewis won his Nobel Prize. They had married in 1927, and by 1930, she was fully back at work. And that's when she produced these really, really remarkable articles about the situation in Germany. She met Hitler in 1931. People always cite this because she's a woman, they always cite this, that she met Hitler and said, he's never going to lead Germany. She was writing an article, I Saw Hitler, for Cosmopolitan, which was also in those days a very different magazine. I assure your readers, very different. And she found him so unimpressive, so wobbly, so weird, that she thought he could not become Chancellor of Germany. And then she watched him become that. And I want to say here, since I can, on her behalf, she was not alone in that. None of them thought Hitler was going to get anywhere. None of them did. She had only made the mistake of saying it out loud. He's never going to be Chancellor. So that became a big thing. And then when she saw that he was gaining ground and could very well become Chancellor, she declared the opposite. She changed her mind. She admitted that she had made a mistake. This is the big thing about Dorothy Thompson. She was never afraid to admit that she had made a mistake on this road that she was following in journalism. If she saw something that she thought it was one way, and then she said later it was some other way, she would almost always acknowledge that this was a change in her thinking. She declared that a person who is seriously thinking and standing in principles is going to look different all around to all kinds of different people. That as things go around, she will be seen to be speaking mostly alone. And she was aware of that. This was her, I believe, the way she actually comported herself. She decided to behave herself on principles, which is admirable, of course, but difficult in real life to accomplish. And just so I don't forget, she was the first correspondent to be expelled from Nazi Germany, the first foreign correspondent. And it made world headlines because she was Mrs. Sinclair Lewis. If it had only been Dorothy Thompson, it surely would have made headlines because all of her colleagues would have written about it because they admired and cared for her so much, all of her American colleagues. But it was because she was Mrs. Sinclair Lewis, it became huge news. And that, in its way, as is not unusual socially in the past, that is what made her huge. Hitler and Sinclair Lewis. So that, within a year or about a couple of years anyway, she was offered a contract by Helen Ogden Reed, who was the publisher of the New York Post by that time, which was also a very different paper. And it was a Republican-leaning paper, right-leaning, but not lunatic. Very, very mainstream Garden Club Republican ladies. And she was offered a column that went syndicated, twice weekly column, 3 times. Thrice weekly. Imagine the work involved in that. I wrote a column monthly, and I thought it would kill me after a while. So she became syndicated and she became a national figure. And her cause was, among a deep, deep suspicion of FDR and the New Deal on grounds of its socialist pungency, her other cause was the defeat of Adolf Hitler. And she spent the next 5 years urging everyone, whipping it up for America in a time of great opposition to involvement in any foreign issue. This was the time of the America Firsters, Father Coughlin, symbols of the people we now have still. This is obviously an American thing. It's not just American. You can look at Germany now and you can see that parts of Eastern Germany are reminiscent of the worst of Florida. They are. And that's happening all over Europe now, an anti-immigrant stand. So this is going to happen. And of course, my theory is the same as what hers was, which is this is the problem with people, that we can look at it in terms of nationalities or countries or ideologies. But in the end, you look at history and you see the problem is there's a lot of people in it and they don't behave well, many of them. So I think she understood that. She was the daughter of a Methodist minister around upstate New York. And she instilled what she would have identified as a Christian value of tolerance and the insight into the person over the group in terms of, I'm talking about this because when the war ended and Hitler was defeated, there was just, of course, the most enormous rage against Germany. And she was pleading for our involvement in rebuilding Germany rather than punishing Germany. But also, she didn't think it was specifically the Holocaust and the atrocities of the war were not a strictly German characteristic. They were a human characteristic made possible. That's when her decline began, as she put it herself, began decline in 1949, when she was arguing first in favor of a just peace with Germany and a cooperative spirit with Germany. But also she was beginning to see the problem that the creation of Israel was going to pose in the Middle East. And she went a great deal into that to her, well, I don't know what to call it. It was to her honor, I think, but it was damaging to her career. She was perceived as, she is still called anti-Semitic when she was no such thing. Anyone who reads Dorothy Thompson's words can see that is not what the issue is. That's not the issue she was on. It was not anti-Semitism. In fact, one of her big first published pieces was interviewing Chaim Weizmann, I think. Yes. Well, certainly was on the boat. She was traveling to Europe, and I think she met Weizmann a little later in London. But she was traveling on a boat with Orthodox Jews on their way to a conference, a Zionist conference in London. This is 1920. And she was full of praise, nothing but praise, for these valorous people and their principles and specifically their pledge for Israel to be a cooperative state rather than a lone. It was to blend. It was not to determine the nature of the state in Palestine. She called it when Israel was created. She said this is a bad idea. You're trying to assuage your conscience for what happened in Europe. That's why there was so much support so quickly for a Jewish state. And I should get clear that we don't have to talk about me and the Jewish state, but I have no affiliations one way or the other on this issue. None. My father was converted to Islam in his later life. He was living and married in Morocco. And so he converted, and he ended up, before he died, being a quite faithful and devout Muslim. I don't know much about that, except that I know it's the case. But I grew up in the belief that Israel was a good thing. I have always regarded Israel as a noble cause in my heart somewhere. I wonder where to put that now. I'm not sure, because it conflicts with an awful lot in my head. And I think the same happened with Dorothy Thompson. I think she found that this particular issue was too large for her to absorb wholly.
Dorothy Thompson was instrumental in helping the Jewish refugees of World War II.
She certainly was.
There's that extraordinary series by PBS, The U.S. and the Holocaust, 3-part series that I recommend everyone watch.
Oh, yes, it's wonderful.
And they talk about how in the 1930s, American sentiment, they blamed the Jews for what was being done to them in Germany. And there's all these stories of Jewish ships of refugees being turned away and having to be sent back to their deaths. And Dorothy, with her column, The Pen Being Mightier Than the Sword, where she was really waging war against fascism through her column, She was grabbing Americans by the collar and saying, we have to care about what's being done to the Jews. Like, that's our struggle.
She certainly was, and very early.
And she would have columns straight up saying, this is why, headlines, something like, this is why we have to care about what's being done to the Jews. And she was instrumental specifically with refugee rights. From what I understand, she turned her beautiful farm in Vermont. I want to just present some color for our listeners. On her birthday in Berlin, when her divorce from that hot Hungarian guy was being finalized, Sinclair Lewis shows up to her intimate birthday party, immediately falls in love with her, immediately proposes to her, and promises that night that he will build her a farm in Vermont, even takes out a piece of paper and draws what it's going to look like. And that's what they ended up building. And they build together their farm in Vermont. And she goes ahead and she turns that farm into a refugee camp.
Yes, she does.
And it's pretty incredible because he wants to divorce her because of Hitler, because she's become so obsessed with Hitler. And one of the things he would always...
That's right. That's what he used to say.
Yeah, he'd always say that in his divorce to Dorothy Thompson, he would list Hitler as like as the reason.
Yeah, he would name Hitler as the correspondent. He would come into the house and he would ask suspiciously, is she talking about it? And it became Dorothy's world in his mind. They were actually, in the end, not suited at all for each other. And he was, of course, a hopeless alcoholic. I say that kindly. I know he tried in his many ways. He went to sanitariums, as they used to call them. We would call them treatment places now. He just couldn't do it until the last couple of years of his life. And this was, of course, more destructive than anything Dorothy might have brought in home with her from work.
Like, I got emotionally exhausted just researching him, reading about him.
Oh, yeah.
He must have been a piece of work.
Oh, I know. Well, again, he is a kind of genius. She wasn't wrong about that. A lot of writers look at him as a hack now.
Really?
Basically, yeah. Well, I don't know. You know how writers are. They get into these things. They decide they have to have an opinion. Everyone has to think something about Sinclair Lewis. I don't know.
Why do you think she stayed with him for so long? Because he was a monster, and he would call her the talking woman.
He was a monster. She stayed with him two ways. One is that they were mostly apart. They were mostly meeting each other again. It was a reunion. And so there could be always that kind of excitement about it. But she was mostly away. She was mostly preoccupied and not with their child, I add sorrowfully.
My heart breaks when I was reading your book. My heart breaks for Michael Lewis, their child. And I read how he died. There was like some obituary, some notice saying that he just passed at a young age. And for some reason, I got the impression that maybe it was suicide.
I haven't heard anything that would make me think it was, except to the extent that he knew he wasn't taking care of himself at all. I expect he was still pouring booze down his throat and smoking cigarettes until his last breath.
Wow.
And I have been very close to his sons, Gregory and John Paul, who are Dorothy's and Red's heirs. They have a half-sister from Michael's second marriage. But I have been close to both of them. And John Paul died last summer, not this past one, but the one before. Older, but in much the same sense. It was a cancer, and there were cigarettes, and he was wonderful. I love John Paul. And Gregory, who I don't know quite as well, but we're still in touch. But no, she did not put her attention on being a mother. She did it in the way she thought a mother of means would do it. Michael was Michael himself and became Michael. So it wasn't just the way he was raised. And everyone blames her. They never say anything about him, about Red Lewis.
Sinclair Lewis was a horrific father.
Yeah. Oh, no.
It had nothing to do with his kids. I want to just add some things to Dorothy Thompson. She was a suffragette, as you mentioned. New York State was a critical state to finally securing women the right to vote. And Dorothy Thompson was a general in that war.
She was.
Like, she physically went above and beyond to make sure that everything was in place to finally get New York in line. Like, she was a massive general.
She was very deep in on that. I'm very proud of that.
And then also she was the inspiration of the Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy movie, Woman of the Year, where Spencer and Hepburn met and found love.
Yeah.
And that character is based on Dorothy Thompson.
The idea came from the image of Dorothy Thompson, yes.
Yeah, where there's this cosmopolitan woman who speaks all these different languages.
And she's a specifically European reporter who goes over there and knows everything about Europe as well as doing her column. So that was where Dorothy was wondering if she could sue on that.
Oh, really?
Well, I don't think she wondered very seriously. She called it an abomination or something because of the way in the end, Katharine Hepburn gives up her career and starts cooking eggs for Spencer Tracy. So on those grounds alone, she might have said, well, that's not realistic. But she was friends with all of them. This is the thing. She was friends with the writer. She knew everybody. Everyone knew everybody. And I was very close also with Jane Gunther, with John Gunther's wife.
John Gunther was one of the leading journalists of the day. He covered the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany, and he talked about how there's no difference between them.
That's right. And that was Dorothy's view as well, is that there's really not. We have this thing that's happened in America with Trump supporters who are going on the same impulses and urges that the Nazis were, which is the reverence for the leader, the veneration of the leader. All fascists have had that in Spain, in Italy, in Germany. They all had the leader who had to be worshipped.
The strong man, he alone can fix it. He's gonna crush our enemies and get rid of all our problems.
The strong man, oh yes. In the followers, it had to become an exalted religious feeling. It's not just that they were all ordered to do that.
It's human nature. I want to ask about the famous story of Dorothy Thompson crashing the Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. And she's in a ball gown, laughing at the top of her lungs, surrounded by all these thick-necked Proud Boys.
Well, she was on her way to a party, which was probably true of any night that you would see her in New York in the 30s. And she was on her way to a party, but she knew this was happening. She knew that the German-American Bund was rallying. She had already sent her daggers toward its leader, Fritz Kuhn, and Father Coughlin, who was called the radio priest, who was way, way, way right-wing, anti-Semitic. There's one who was, openly. And just right populist, we might call it now, I don't know. But she knew they were gathering there. And I expect she knew that she could make herself noticed. That was her goal, was for people to see what she was doing. It wasn't just that she did it. She wanted people to see what was going on there. So she went in and she sat in the press box where she could always sit at Madison Square Garden. I don't remember exactly how many tens of thousands of American Nazi sympathizers were there, something like 30,000 anyway. And she burst out laughing when they tried to make their speeches. She just kept laughing and laughing from the press gallery. And then they heckled her and she heckled them back. And then they had to get her out of there, as it was put, for her own safety. Because she was hustled. She was being surrounded by the little fancy boy Nazis, thugs, all these little boxers and little men, as she would call them. She was being surrounded by them. And so the police who were there to keep order escorted her out and said, it's best, don't come back. She didn't want to go back.
What were some of the things she said to them when she was heckling?
Bunk. She kept crying, it's pure bunk. Total bunk. Nonsense. Don't be ridiculous. That's what she was yelling at, and laughing in between. Oh, get out. Ha, 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 ha. Wonderful, right? I simply love that story.
Tell the story of how she destroyed Charles Lindbergh's public career.
I think he destroyed his own. Lindbergh destroyed his own public career, but she certainly helped. I was friendly with Anne Lindbergh, the daughter, Charles Lindbergh's daughter, who lived in Vermont for a long time before she died. There was still a lot of, it wasn't bitterness so much as reserve on that when you got near that topic. And I don't think they were trying to protect their father's reputation so much as I think it had been a hurtful thing for them to hear him called a cretin what did she call him? A somber cretin, she would have said. She really went after him. Well, but look at it. He was exactly the kind of strongman, if we're going to call it strongman. He was the guy. He was an American hero already. He was a serious isolationist. He thought we should have nothing to do with anything going on over there. And as such, he was building a following. And it would be very, not at all, as we can see now, not at all unusual, should he really go far with that. I mean, not to generalize, but the American character seems to have something in there that is so independent it wants to glue itself to some leader. Do you know what I mean? Because they're all about freedom and independence, and there they are, stuck like little gummies onto the big leader.
Did she get death threats for the work that she was doing in the U.S., like taking on the Nazis?
Oh, yes. There are files in her archive at Syracuse that contain some of the hate mail she got.
Wow. And what were some of the things that people said to her?
She was a dirty Jew lover. That's what they were saying before the war. She, who later was called anti-Semitic, she was being mostly abused for that and also for wanting to kill our sons by sending them to war.
Right, being a warmonger.
A warmonger and a Jew lover, yeah.
A warmonger and a Jew lover. So after Hitler kicks her out of Germany, she regroups. She goes to New York City. Her old friend from the suffragist movement, Helen Reed, who is the scrappy assistant who marries the heir of the rich family that owns the Herald Tribune. Helen, she runs the Herald Tribune. She stacks it full of women. She becomes, she's very modern and innovative. And as part of her whole strategy to push for greater equality of women in the workplace at this powerful newspaper, she hires Dorothy to write a women's column 3 times a week, but it becomes a column. It becomes like a column for the whole world, including Churchill and FDR, and she's advising these world leaders. But she ends up having a falling out with Helen Reed because they both joined forces with this idea, Helen Reed's Herald Tribune being a Republican, stately Garden Party Republican newspaper. They sort of joined forces very early on to have this column because one of the reasons that Dorothy appealed to Helen is because Dorothy feared FDR because she saw socialism as a dictatorship moving, very quickly in the Soviet Union, and Walter Duranty advising FDR. And so she wanted to curb FDR because FDR was trying to move quickly. He was trying to pack the courts.
Oh, yes, she had real fears about FDR.
Mm-hmm. And Helen Reed loved that. That really united them.
Yeah.
And in the final hour, Dorothy switches alliances, betrays Helen Reed by using her column that Helen Reed is paying for to endorse FDR.
She had been a backer of Wendell Willkie, who was
a businessman. Wendell Willkie was a businessman who sued the federal government for overreach.
Yeah.
And that appealed to Dorothy because he was standing up for the Constitution.
That's right. But I'll tell you, in the end, she couldn't vote for Willkie. She felt he didn't have it for the job. I have never heard of anything more than that behind it. I have never heard anything but her own consideration for switching in the middle of the election campaign. But she did. She decided she could not endorse the Republican candidate. And so she endorsed FDR, and this was big news, of course. It ultimately did lose her the column in the Herald Tribune and the Post. Not instantly, but very soon afterwards. She was syndicated by other people.
And it was the end of her friendship with Helen Reed.
It was. I'm sure they were very cordial.
Well, not in my script.
Because that's how they all behaved with each other. I mean, I knew some of the women of that, some of her friends, her women friends. This is a long time ago, There was a lot of people still around. They all knew how to behave with each other. There was a purported feud between Dorothy Thompson and Clare Boothe Luce, who was married to Henry Luce, the founder of Time, and who was herself a great socialite. She told me that it was mostly press whipping up interest. There was nothing much going on between her and Dorothy. Nothing more than they would expect as witty writers. Little put downs and things like that. But it was not a serious political feud. And so I assume with Helen, I know with Helen it was, because Dorothy had let down the newspaper and the party and the side. It wasn't just a personal thing.
I want to end our interview on love, the love story between Dorothy Thompson and Christa Winslow.
I love Christa. I have such a warm feelings about Christa. Isn't that something? She died tragically in the Second World War, mistaken for a Nazi sympathizer.
Oh, wow. So she was killed by the resistance.
Yeah.
Ugh.
She and her girlfriend of the time. It was more local. It wasn't because she was German specifically. They were caught on the edge of the wrong side of whatever was going on in the center of France. It was the resistance in central France. And they just were dragged out, I assume, like many people, and shot.
Wow.
But there's a lot of her letters in German that I have that are at Syracuse, but I have copies of them because I love them so much. That shows you what a intelligent and warm and uplifting and fun person Christa was. She
was a playwright, a novelist.
A very famous because of Women in Mädchen in Uniform, the German first. It was a big movie in 1932, and it was all over the U.S. Girls in Uniform. She was famous for that.
She wrote that.
She wrote that.
What was her love affair with Dorothy Thompson like, and how did her murder impact Dorothy?
There's one letter from Dorothy about hearing her death, and it's truly brokenhearted, but it's not addressed to anyone directly involved with Christa. It sounds brokenhearted to me. Maybe I'm reading into it, that she talks about that fine, sensitive soul with Christa. There was a period from 1932 when they met in Austria to 1935, I would suppose, when Christa, having tried to live in the United States, went back to Germany. And they were very, very much together as a known couple at that time. I'm speaking about their friends. I don't mean publicly known. No one was among their friends. One of the first people I talked to was Lillian Maurer, who had been there on the night Sinclair Lewis proposed to Dorothy Thompson. And we were just talking, and then she said in the middle of it, of course, Dorothy was a big lesbian on the side. And I said, oh, yes, well, can you tell me more about that? And Lillian would say, well, they would stumble in together. Christa and Dorothy, they'd been out, maybe they'd been drinking, they would stumble home together, they'd be laughing, and they'd collapse and go into Dorothy's room. It was not a secret in that sense among people who knew them. In Vermont, Twin Farms is still, if there's anyone who still remembers, is still called a lesbian haven from the people that Dorothy had there before, during, and after the war. She sponsored a lot of her friends among German refugees. She wasn't just working on behalf of increasing immigration quotas, which she could not succeed in getting the United States to do. But she did import a number of her own friends, and so it was called Lesbians in Them Hills, really. I'm just saying, locally, it was one of the first things I ever heard.
So she created a lesbian refugee camp.
Yeah, basically, and settled her friends all around her. Years ago, I was giving a talk about Dorothy in Florida while Blanche Wiesen Cook was talking about Eleanor Roosevelt. And Blanche Cook was the one who really blew the lid off Eleanor Roosevelt's lesbian identity.
That's confirmed that Eleanor Roosevelt was a lesbian?
Well, Blanche Cook interprets it that way. I was just about to say, I'm not so sure that these women can be called that these were women of a certain generation, the first educated class of women in the United States, basically, college educated. And they're off in they're wrapped up in suffrage. They're fighting for women's rights. They're involved with each other. And it is perfectly natural, of course, that there would be love between them and among them. And I believe a lot of these women who may have had female lovers, who some of them certainly did, were aware that men weren't up to it. Men couldn't meet them where they were. Only other women could meet them where they were. And I believe that has a lot to do with it. But Blanche Cook asked me why had I dropped the issue of Dorothy's lesbianism in the book after the breakup with, or the end of it with Krista. And I said, I didn't drop it. She dropped it. And that's the truth. There's nothing else in her papers that she left behind that would indicate that that was anything she wanted to talk about further.
Well, that was just the love of her life.
That was, exactly. So I'm always reluctant when they hold these women up as lesbian banners or when that happens in any identity group. It happens with gay men all the time too. And I'm gay, so I can say that. Don't worry. But anyway, it happens all the time. James Dean was homosexual, was great gay. What? James Dean was not Rock Hudson. Okay, let's put it that way. Let's put it that way. I understand the need or the perceived need for heroes and banners, but I'm natively suspicious of them because they sound like the thing Dorothy was against.
Mm-hmm. She was, first and foremost, a free spirit, a nonconformist, independent thinker, and that was her gift.
Yes, and I can say with gladness that she did not betray herself as she went along. She was ultra courageous.
Hey, how about we set aside everything? What is everything done for us? We may make our names into formless shapes, or fading and transient, and stand arm in arm in the streets, indifferent and unmovable, till somebody says it right, until somebody says our name. We always stand apart. Of course the fault is mine. We always stand apart. All blame, of course, is mine. Stage would start aside just beyond the reach. So to act in any way is just to react to that strange force that may not be. Say with me that it may not be. Here we always stand apart. Of course the fault is mine.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up for the Truth Teller level or higher on Patreon at patreon.com/gaslit. To help the refugees of the Israel-Hamas war, donate to Doctors Without Borders at doctorswithoutborders.org. We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, and Gaza. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa. Our production manager is Nicholas Torres, and our associate producer is Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank supporters at the producer level and higher on Patreon. Withrow C. Newell, Chick-Quinn, Lily Wachowski, Kenny Main, John Schoenthaler, Ellen McGirt, Larry Gasson, Karen A. Deal, David Collier, Karen Heisler, Ann Bertino, Stephanie Brandt, MD, John Millett, David East, Ida, Joseph Mara Jr., Julie Matthews, Mark, Matthew Womack, Sean Berg, Kristen Custer, Emmy, Kevin Gannon, Mike Christensen, Sandra Collins, Katie Masuris, James D. Leonard, Leo Chalupa, Carol Golstad, Jason Banky, Marcus J. Trent, Joe Darcy, Ann Marshall, Jeremy Lewis, Trigve, D.L. Singfield, Nicole Spear, Abby Rode, Jans Alstrup Rasmussen, Sarah Gray, Diana Gallagher, Leah Campbell, Jared Lombardo, Ann Marshall, and Tanya Chalupa. Thank you all so much for the support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you. And happy holidays and New Year to all. Thank you.